In this second section, we're looking at the relationship between racism and colonialism, because in many ways, racism gets kind of invented and then spread around the world through colonialism, both as a belief, but also as a set of practices, which we'll look at. So firstly, we need to understand how race fits into, or racism fits into colonialism. Now, racism, as we tend to know it today, or the main features of racism tend to come out of Europe. Now, that doesn't mean that the rest of the world is not racist. We'll come back to that. But the European form of racism emerges when we get this kind of overlapping of definitions of nation and race and religion. Because in Europe in the 15, 16, 1700s, they talked about like the English race and the French race and the Spanish race. So your nationality was seen to be part of the race, of your race. And there was a kind of like an idea that genetically or biologically, the English people spread when they reproduced, and their children would pass on various characteristics from the mother to the, or the parents to the child in terms of their what we now know as racial features. And so we get this idea of race coming out of Europe. Now that doesn't mean that in different parts of the world there wasn't racism, because all groups tend to discriminate against other groups and tend to be fearful of outsiders and put some kind of categorizations about those outsiders. So in the long history of Thailand, there's been a fear of Burmese and also of Cambodians and the Vietnamese and the Chinese, and the Vietnamese and the Khmer, all have some of these kind of views of each other, which we may consider today to be racist. But there's no kind of structure like racism around it. It was more like a fear about the fear of outsiders. What colonialism did is made racism a science and also made it a form of government and a form of control of different people. So it was much stronger, it was much more strict. So again, coming back to Southeast Asia, there was a lot of kind of overlap and interrelations between Chinese and Thai and Burmese and Korean and all the different groups. So there was kind of an overlap there. There wasn't really an idea that the race should keep apart, but there was a fear of the different political systems and different groups. Okay, and that's why I need to look at this kind of very strong legacy of colonial racism. Because when ISO came out, it was based very much on this idea of eliminating forms of racism based on these colonial views. So let's start unpacking the science of it. Now, one key part of the science, and this came a bit later in terms of colonialism, is the ideas from Charles Darwin and his ideas of ideas of what we call social Darwinism. And we have a couple of pictures here which can kind of illustrate how social Darwinism worked. So first we need to kind of look at what Darwinism and the idea of evolution means. So Darwin was saying that how life changes, it evolves over time through natural selection and survival of the fittest. Those kind of offspring which have the strongest features or the best fit to the natural landscape, they're going to survive and breed more. And therefore, animals and life changes over time and it gradually evolves to fit its environment, and hence the term kind of survival of the fittest. Those that fit the environment the best are the ones that are going to survive. That's why I say giraffes have long necks, because the longer the neck, the more of the tree that you can eat. Now, what happened with racism is they kind of picked up and modified this idea in a very unscientific way, to assume that we can take these ideas of evolution, but also put these over social groups. And so this is the idea of social Darwinism. So instead of saying like why a giraffe gets a neck, has a long neck, this is why the English are superior than the Chinese, for example. So you can see on the pictures on the left, you can have this kind of the biological legacy still in this idea of racism, with the idea of here that the Africans, or as they're called here, the Negroes, are closer to a monkey than they are to a white person. Again, this is not true at all. These are just kind of made up pictures of what the skull looks like. And then on the right-hand side, you get this into this kind of hierarchy or classification of races, where the very peak of the races is the English person in the top left-hand corner here, who's done as William Shakespeare. So it's a picture of Shakespeare as if he's the most kind of evolved person. Then you go down through this kind of like, they call it like this ladder of through Chinese, who are seen to be next, Then down, I'm not quite sure exactly what these races are, but it kind of ends up at the bottom with the kind of indigenous groups, like the indigenous Australians at the very bottom there. But you have Native Americans there, and maybe Indians or the Middle East there. But this idea there's a kind of natural hierarchy or a ladder, with English as being the most evolved and indigenous groups such as the Australian Aborigines as the least evolved group. Now, of course, this is all wrong because social Darwinism doesn't work in social groups at all. It's not like societies or communities have some way of evolving. This is much more about power and technology, about why some groups are more powerful or spread more than other groups. Now, another important point to this racism, and this is another continuation of social Darwinism, this assumption that you can see there's an evolution from a particular type of animal to a particular type of human. Again, completely wrong, because it's not like humans evolved from different types of animals. You know, all humans have a common ancestor, and that relates to, the same common ancestor we share with like an orangutan or a monkey or something. But we've evolved off in different directions. Now, another important way is this linking between science and a more quantifiable or measurable ideas of race, assuming that race can be measured. And this is done in a couple of ways. One of these various ways of measuring the human body. And so on the left here, we have people measuring skulls and how big your nose was, and the distance between your eyes. That's sometimes called phrenology or anthropometry, which is this idea that race is a measurable phenomenon by the physical characteristics, particularly like looking at skulls and skull size. And this is also, you can see it on the right-hand side, this kind of idea that the skull size, the bigger the skull, the more smarter you were. And this graph here, which shows that as here they say blacks or Africans have a smaller skull size than whites and Orientals or East Asians. Now, the way they measured this was quite fraudulent. So they picked like adult white males against young female Africans to try and make sure those measurements came out accurately. We know that the bigger the skull is, it doesn't mean the smarter you are. Otherwise, taller and bigger people will be smarter than shorter people. And that's obviously just not quite true. But it's a very kind of simple way of assuming that because skulls are bigger and brains are bigger, therefore white people are smarter. We also see this more recently in attempts to measure IQ. And again, this is false. There is no IQ division based on race. Now, IQ can be, there are inherited characteristics of IQs, but also it does depend on what the IQ test is testing you on, and a bit about education and so on. So again, this is a made-up idea that black people have less IQ than white people. Now, there's a whole story here behind how they actually got these statistics and made it up. There's a very good book on it called The Mismeasurement of Man, where this researcher shows all these kinds of attempts to measure things like IQ and skull size. They're based on very bad science with very misleading, bad sample sizes, very misleading criteria, and so they could actually get these findings, which are just not true. Also, it's seen in terms of this one about looking at insides of brains to try and think that there is such a thing as a criminal mind and such a thing as a normal mind. Now, there may be criminal behaviors, and sometimes crimes may be pathological or biological. But crime in many cases just depends on the social circumstances and education and lack of discrimination and so on. But this is by selecting certain skulls to try and show that because normal skulls are much more rounder and much more symmetrical and have a lot more folds in them, they are more intelligent, whereas the criminal ones are more bent and not as developed and so on. Again, these are attempts to get science to match up with these beliefs. In all the case, they're cherry picking science. They're picking very particular kind of pictures of particular skulls, as if to demonstrate their beliefs. Again, these have all been proven to be false. Now, a very famous case study which helps illustrate this is the case of the fraud of what's called Piltdown Man. I just want to talk about this as a story to show the lengths that science went to try and prove that white people were superior. because after evolution was like the main theory, in 1900 the English were very concerned because they thought they were the most superior race, but it seemed like that humans had actually evolved and emerged from Africa. And how could it be that Africans, who are black and should be the least developed, are the oldest race of humans? And so they said, well, what we have to do is we've got to try and find scientific proof that humans were first discovered in England. And they searched and couldn't find it until one day this guy dug up a skull, which is supposed to show that the very first modern humans emerged in England. But of course it was a fraud. He just planted the skull there himself. Now what he wanted to prove is this idea that there were two theories about how humans evolved. One was that they got a big brain, and because they got that big brain, they got better hunters. And because we're better hunters, they could eat more and they could get better. And so it was that the brain evolved first, and then the jaws and the ability to eat evolved. But the other theory, which kind of came out of Africa, was that humans evolved these kind of good teeth and good jaws to eat a lot of meat. And because they got bigger and they got stronger, and their brains started developing because they could hunt better and so on. So there's two competing theories. Either man evolved because they had a big brain and they were smart, and that's what the theory that the English used, or man evolved because they could eat and they could hunt and they could eat, and their jaw evolved, and therefore their brain evolved after that, which is the actual how humans evolved. They didn't evolve by being smart; they evolved by being good hunters and being able to eat a lot. So the Piltdown skull was buried with the top picture there, with this big skull and a small jawbone. But this was just a fraud. But that fraud was planted in the 1910s, and it was still believed in the 1950s and 1960s. It wasn't really until the 1960s when they did a carbon dating to prove that it was a fraud. But this shows that, firstly, the beliefs there was what drove the science, and not the science driving the beliefs. And that's been a big problem in terms of dealing with race. Now, also, so we get from the science, we move to the kind of the government of race. And this is where we look at the colonial systems of how racism was put into practice. So if you believe that white people are superior, certain races are superior, that meant the governments thought we should separate the races. This is done most clearly in the forms of apartheid in Africa, put in place, I think, around the 1920s and 1930s up to the 1980s. We also see versions of apartheid occurring, of course, segregation in America, the treatment of Indigenous people in New Zealand to a lesser extent, but also very strongly in Australia and Canada and in America. And so it was all assumed that we need to split the races, and they shouldn't be able to breed, and they should be treated differently. Also, we see in terms of colonialism that these forms of racism were used so the business empires could profit. So there was an exploitation of non-European labor, and so indentured labor and slave labor was based on people of different races and the belief that we could enslave a black person, we can't enslave a white person, but also to take over the natural resources itself and the resource extraction, which you still see occurring with the taking over Indigenous lands, with the belief that Indigenous people aren't using this resource well enough. And it's also kind of made moral as well, that white Christian people, it's their duty to go out to kind of evangelize, to kind of bring the Christianity to these poor races because they don't know what they're doing. And so it's seen to be helping these poor, lesser developed races was an important thing. So it wasn't that they wanted to spread this kind of hatred of other races. It was more they're spreading this idea these poor races need our help. So you see this in examples of apartheid in South Africa here. This is a sign kind of showing the brutality of apartheid. The natives, Indians, and coloured, because with apartheid they gave these different distinctions. Whether you're Indian, coloured, or native. If you enter these premises at night, you'll be listed as missing, and armed guards may shoot you, and dogs may eat your corpses. So it's a very brutal system. And we see it in terms of like the business of race and racism with these products which were made from plantations, often made from, in the early days, made from slave or indentured labor. The use of soap, there's this idea that soap can be used to clean up make a black boy white. And as you may see, or you wouldn't see, or some of you in Thailand would know, there's like a toothpaste called Dali, which is based on these darkie. these racist images of Africans. Okay, we'll pause it there.